In 1999, I spent a majority of the winter up at my cabin in the mountains of Colorado to try and escape the craziness of life. It was the coldest winter on record that I can remember. I didn't expect it to be any different. I had been chopping up a load of firewood when I heard my name being called out from further away, deeper in the forest. At first, I thought nothing of it, but as time went on, it got closer and closer, until finally, I couldn't help but feel extremely uneasy about whatever was calling my name. I gathered my wits and began to investigate where the sounds were coming from, thinking that possibly some other hikers could have gotten lost. But what I found instead made my blood run cold with terror. It was late on the 7th night of my trip, when I would hear the sounds again and again. It was dark out, and I had been sleeping soundly in my warm bed, until whatever it was started calling for me again, and it scared the daylights out of me. The wails of this thing echoed throughout the trees and sent shivers down my spine. But then, something else more vaguely human joined in with its cries. There were more of them. Something about this memory traumatized me, but I can't exactly explain why. I knew it wasn't normal, so I did what any sane person would do. Packed up my gear and hightailed it back to the city. I've never been back to that cabin since. I don't ever plan on going camping up there again. From what I know, the Wendigo is out there, and it wants me. At the time, I didn't know it was a Wendigo, but as I spent more time talking to people, like who I had spent years living with, isolated, alone in the same mountains, they too have had the same experiences I had, hearing strange voices and things and experiencing supernatural occurrences. It's almost as if I brought something with me, and now it wants to make sure that I never go back again. My time spent up in Canada hunting soon turned sour once I had my very own run-in with something I can only describe as a Wendigo. I was hunting caribou in the northernmost tip of Ontario when I noticed something strange. I've heard of the many legends out there, like Chupacabra and Bigfoot, but this was something entirely different. It's been said that the Algonquin folklore, a Wendigo is seen as a malevolent spirit or demon, often associated with winter storms, who embodies gluttony. It lures people into the cold northern forests to kill them and feast upon their flesh. Those who indulged in cannibalism were at particular risk, according to reports from white settlers from earliest contact onward, which may explain why legends of the Wendigo have proliferated among communities where such practices occurred. I know something was off when I saw it running through the brush during my trip up north. I thought it was just an average wolverine at first, but then its eyes glowed a bright red as my flashlight pointed towards it. They were vicious, an unnatural feeling that did not seem to match this region of land, not even close to the harsh environment around us. At first, I thought it was a wolverine, but I realized this was not the case. It appeared to be about 5 feet tall with thick brown fur and piercing red-yellow eyes. It had claws for hands and large sharp teeth protruding from its jaws, which looked like they could tear open anything in their path. I was walking north on a trail where I began to notice an awful stench, similar to rotting meat and feces. This is when I saw it, or what appeared to be 2 legs sticking out from behind a tree, about 10 feet away from me. Suddenly, it uprooted itself, lunging at me with its sword-like claws that were dripping. I ducked just under them as they swung right at my face, where it would have been had I not dodged. I grabbed my rifle, firing 2 quick shots into its chest, but it didn't even seem to faze it as it lunged at me again, swiping for my head. This was something that has haunted Canadians for centuries, if not millennia. A Wendigo. It's said that Wendigos are spirits that possess an individual, consuming them with greed until all their fat is scavenged, and only bones remain before the Wendigo moves on. Apparently, they could also shapeshift and take the form of animals, or any their form they want. They have a hunger for human flesh that is never ending, driven by the ultimate desire to consume. Wendigos, I learned from many of the Algonquin tribe, are vicious, and they will not stop no matter what. Anyway, so I shot this thing again, and I noticed this black ooze from the wound on its side. Obviously, my shot had taken effect. I was beginning to run low on bullets, so I ran and took cover behind some trees while it closed in on me. It let out this awful moan before flinging itself towards me again, this time feigning left after right, trying to trick me. The look of hunger and hate in its eyes made my blood curdle like milk left out of the fridge too long. I could feel bile crawling up my throat as I watched it try to get to me. It lunged yet again, and this time going for my throat, which I luckily evaded just in time as it grabbed hold of my arm and sunk its sharp teeth into my flesh. It bit down so hard, I could feel my flesh slowly tearing away from bone, like a knife cutting through butter. I reached around to where I had one arrow knocked on my back, pulled it out quickly, jamming it right into this thing's eye socket. This created enough space between us to lift up my rifle above its head and fire into the top of its skull, which didn't kill it, but sent it screaming. I used this as an opportunity to flee. Partially blinded and filled full of holes, this thing couldn't have been living for that long. I fled back to camp, writhing in pain and blood, until I reached the other hunters and demanded they pack up immediately. We trudged our way back through the snow, somehow not dying of blood loss, when we hear this thing off in the distance, howling. It was paralyzingly terrifying. Even though we were several kilometers away at this point, we could still hear it. This thing was loud. This sent me flying faster than ever before. I never really believed in creatures like this living in the forest, but I realize now that nothing is truly impossible. I never expected to see something like that in the forest. I never thought such things even existed, let alone in Canada. Never even read about them, never mind seeing them with my own eyes. I can never go back into those woods again. I have no interest in leaving the comfort of my home. This was not a normal creature, even for this terrain. It just stands out so much more than what you normally expect to find deep within the wilderness. To be honest, after all these years, I still think about it often, wondering how different my life would have been had I never come across something so evil and vicious. This was an experience that will surely never leave me, but one I don't plan on hopefully ever having again. The look in its eyes still haunts me to this day. I never understood what drives somebody to want to possess the flesh of another human being, but I truly never wished this on anybody, what I experienced. To some, it might have just been a normal animal in the forest, but for me, it was so much more than that. From here on out, I will never question something until I know exactly what is going on, which also means never camping again either. There are some that say Wendigos are implacable evil because they are driven by an insatiable hunger that will never end, never giving them peace. It has even been said that once they kill their victim and have consumed them, they will stalk the others, completely ignoring any wounds they might be suffering from. I never believed these stories, but now I have a whole new perspective on the whole thing. I never would have thought such things existed, only to come face to face with one in real life. Never even considered it a possibility until I myself came across the same creature. Some of the natives were so fearful they even refused to speak about what was out there. All except my good friend, who we'll call Bill. He claimed he knew exactly what it was and where they could be found. He himself had even had multiple run-ins with these things and even found the den of one, supposedly. I never wanted anything to do with him again after that, at least hiking and stuff like that. I never cared for his superstitions and never want to be back in those woods again. This wasn't a normal creature or something even close to anything you'd ever expect to find in the real world. I hope this story helps those who are nervous to come out with their own and give them the strength and courage they need to be open with the events that have taken place in their life. I've been wanting to share this story for a while now. I've received it from a friend who does a lot of investigating in cryptid sightings and reports, specifically in the southwestern region of the United States. You wouldn't believe all the paranormal stories and sightings that occur down in this region alone, from Southern California all the way to Western Texas, and even up to Idaho and over to Southern Colorado. Stories involving demonic entities haunting people, seeing strange horned beasts and cryptids off in the desert night, large black felines, and worse. There seems to be a large upswing in Bigfoot sightings too. And recently, I read reports about a large uptick in Skinwalker and dogman sightings as well. There have been countless paranormal stories from this region, but today, we're talking specifically about the Skinwalkers and their habits. Here's one that I will share with you that was shared with me. Back in 2004, a man was driving home from work late one night on Highway 191 when his car had a flat tire, and with nobody around to help him out, he was on his own. The stretch of road where this would happen is Highway 191 in Arizona, right in the Navajo Reservation, outside of Round Rock. It's believed that there are at least many sightings of the Skinwalker all over this region, or so I'm told. These stories come mostly from people who have broken down or have even gotten lost on this unforgiving stretch of highway. And not just the 191, several of them that all interconnect and bleed through this region. A lot of the area still remains uninhabited for very, very long periods of time, if not indefinitely. There are also hundreds of more scary tales surrounding the events of the famous reservation, the Navajo Reservation. Now, this gentleman had finally got his spare tire out and was working on replacing it. His car was jacked up, and he was either taking the old tire off or putting the new one on, when he suddenly noticed the temperature suddenly dropping all around him. It began getting colder and colder, and then something caught his ear. He heard a faint sound, like whispers coming out of the darkness, terrifying him so much that he runs back to his car for safety. He tried comforting himself, explaining that it was probably just the wind, and there was a cool breeze, and that there had to have been a reason for this. And this is when he heard the whispers. Whatever it was, whispering, getting closer. He could hear whatever horrible thing it was breathing out its nose like a distressed animal. And something scary had happened. Whatever being was making this, he heard it all around him. It was like it was right next to him, and then it was off in the distance, and back and forth. He started to hurry again, getting out of the car and getting this tire on now. And as soon as he got the next tire on, he noticed yellow eyes glinting in the darkness. He looks over and sees this being, barely visible, only about 20 feet away from him in the night shadows, a long set face with yellow piercing eyes. He flies into the car, slamming on the horn, in hopes it would drive this person away. But this thing did not even move an inch. He began to hear terrifying noises, a growling, and his heart pounding like never before. And he saw the face of this thing that looked something right out of a horror movie. He was in complete shock when looking at what one could only be described as the most horrifying face he's ever seen. He said it was gray and wrinkled dead skin, pointed ears set deep within its skull, fangs dripping saliva. He explained it in detail. Whatever this creature was, it had no problems communicating, because immediately after seeing him there on the side of the road, it spoke to him. Not in voice though, but telepathically, as demonic creatures usually do. It explained to him it was going to kill him and make him suffer. He was so petrified, he urinated all over himself. And before this thing could try and get into his car, another vehicle shot over the horizon, flying in his direction, driving this being away. Help had arrived, and as it turned out, it was actually a Navajo medicine man who had been praying and knew that he was sent out here on a mission from God himself to rescue this lone man from evil. The medicine man explained to the man that he had been sent here to help somebody from evil, and that somebody was him. He told him that the spirits had communicated and told him there was somebody stuck that needed help on this exact road. Wouldn't you know it? And that's exactly what had happened. He should have been killed by whatever it was lurking in the shadows before being rescued by the medicine man. The explanation didn't stop there, though, because ever since then, terrifying things continue to happen, including horrific dreams, being telepathically communicated to by him, by something that is desperately trying to get into his life and tear him down. The medicine man even thoroughly explained to the man that had he not shown up, this thing would have taken his soul. When you escape something this horrifying, with something evil like a skinwalker, out in the desert of night, on Highway 191 outside of Round Rock, nothing else matters anymore. The only thing that mattered was realizing the skinwalker's true form and what a terrifying experience it all had been. I realize this is a very long email, but after talking with a friend who had many similar skinwalker encounter stories, I felt the need to share this one. Things like this have been going on all throughout the reservation, and many of the natives refuse to talk about it. They're afraid of being shunned and also inviting this thing into their lives. And this isn't just Navajo exclusive. Many tribes all over the US and even into Canada report similar evil shape-shifting beings. Remember that a skinwalker is specifically a Navajo witch who practices black magic. It's the worst thing you can become if you're a native. It's very difficult. Mastering that style of witchcraft involves doing many dark things, severe dedications like murdering of a relative, and other dark practices. There's a reason why they are shunned away from the tribe, and many of them refuse to talk about it. My encounter with these things is something I'll simply never forget. Sometimes, even now, I'm tempted to just forget it ever happened, and hope that maybe I just imagined the whole thing. They say skinwalkers are Native American Indians with the ability to shapeshift into animals by simply wearing their skin or pelt. Some think skinwalkers use their abilities for good purposes, like helping sick people get better. Others say skinwalkers only use their powers for evil, causing sickness, invoking curses on humans and livestock alike. I hadn't believed in skinwalker tales before this, but this experience altogether was something entirely different. It goes a little something like this. I was sitting outside on my porch one night, watching the fireflies dance around in the distance when it happened. I first noticed them. Two dark beings down by the creek, or should I say figures. From their shadows from the light, they appear to be coyotes, large ones, but standing upright, contorting and shifting in size and stature. At first, I thought I was simply imagining things, and by the light of the moon, there was enough that I could clearly see the shape of these. I know what I saw. They were standing on two legs like a man. They even walked like one too, walking very comfortably, the same way a man would hold his balance up. They were clearly not people, though. Their skin, though, what I would later find out when they would walk closer to the light, appeared to be inside out, hanging loosely from their body and snout as they would slither almost through the darkness. I can't explain why, but it didn't seem to bother them that I could see their skin falling off their body. It looked like it was loosely wrapped around bone and muscle, with nothing holding them to each other. It was disgusting, like a rotting corpse. Their eyes were glowing in the darkness of the night, as if lit by an inner fire. I didn't notice the flesh part right away, as I said, until they had appeared more closer to the light, and I could see the terror before me. I can't explain it, but as I said, their skin appeared almost as if it was melting off of them. It was like it was wet and dripping, as if whatever skin they wore wasn't originally theirs. And I'm not talking about a simple animal pelt. I'm talking about the actual flesh that clung to their bones and muscle. It was the most putrid, disturbing thing I've seen. I wanted to run or call for help, but yet I couldn't move. The fear I felt paralyzed me in place, as these beings continued to walk closer still. They stood about 7 feet tall, having human-like torsos, covered by these large fur coats. The skin that I could tell was kind of a grayish green, torn with patches missing from their bodies. If skinwalkers are truly humans who can shapeshift, these things maybe weren't skinwalkers, but something else. Maybe undead. I have no clue. I began praying as loudly as I could as these things began to approach my house from the distance. I didn't know what I'd do if they get up here, but I was sure not going to stick around and find out. I reached for my rifle near the front door when one of them let out a large, strange howl. I pointed my gun, aimed, and took a shot at one of these things, and it screamed. It sounded like a man and an animal scream in one. I think I hit it in the face, but I couldn't tell. Before I knew what was happening, the other one began coming up towards me with an eerie calmness as I reloaded my rifle. The first skinwalker ran back into the darkness where it came off as, and I fired another one, no more than 10 yards away. I hit this one right in the middle of the chest. It stumbled backwards, but only a little, and very slowly rose back up, and now started running in my direction as fast as it could. I had no choice but to run inside my house and get out of there. I locked the door shut, grabbing a butcher knife from the kitchen counter, all before I ran into my bedroom, locking every door. I could hear these things running up to my house, slamming against the paneling, the doors, the windows, causing my entire tiny house to shake and tremble from the impact. Then, I could hear the second one that was joining in with it. They both paced around my house. I could hear them tearing apart my car out there, smashing the windows, throwing things at my house, rocks and whatever miscellaneous objects were out there, shouting and screaming and all sorts of horrible sounds and noises. I was petrified. I wasn't sure what to do next. The next thing I know, I start to hear these strange chanting sounds from all around the trailer. Skinwalkers reciting things that I could not understand in this weird hissing kind of language. From what I've gathered from skinwalkers, I think they were trying to break through the front door, getting inside my house. Somehow, skinwalkers were here all along. It seemed as if this thing badly wanted for me to open the door. I have no idea why they were so determined to get inside, but I think they wanted me. I think they wanted to steal my soul. These skinwalkers were trying for hours at this point, but could not manage to break through my front door or bedroom door. Every time they did something like be banging on the walls of my house and shouting, they could hear where I was, and they'd stop trying to break through. This went on for hours with them trying to break in, and all I could do was sit and be completely scared by what I know what would happen if they happened to get in. I would be dead, and there would be nothing left of me. They would tear me limb from limb if they could. I had no idea what time I was dealing with. This went on for hours until sounds began to completely quiet down. However, even the crickets outside had gone completely silent since this whole thing started, and they had not started back up. It had become so unnaturally quiet, like they were lying in wait for me to make the move and expose my vulnerability. The next thing I know, I heard a loud but subtle howl from what sounded like just right outside my house, from where these things were standing before. I could see shadows moving around in the front window, and it felt as if someone or something was looking inside my house from out. I realized these things had never gone away like I initially thought. Instead, my second thought was right. They had been waiting and watching for the right moment, until I was most vulnerable, for them to try and break in. And in that moment, they were both peering through my window to see if they could see where I was. I happened to see what one of them looked like, and I regret ever looking. The face that I saw peering through the window reminded me exactly the way I described the flesh earlier. Decaying, skeletal. I must have fallen asleep at some point from the sheer exhaustion of fear, because when I came to, there was daylight outside. Completely apprehensive and still nervous, I listened quietly, and I could very faintly hear birds chirping outside and wildlife bustling. I got up quickly and ran outside with my rifle in hand. Didn't see anything. My car was badly trashed. All the windows were shattered, and the doors looked like the bear had attacked them. and there were these strange symbols carved into the ground and on the sides of my trailer. They appeared to be etched in with claw marks. What I don't understand is they trashed my car, tore metal, and shattered windows, but yet they couldn't break down my door or shatter my windows to my house. It makes me believe that this whole thing was an intimidation tactic, a way to terrify me. Because if they really wanted me, I believe they could have. I was not going to risk this for a second night in a row, so I decided to go spend the rest of the day and night at my brother's house, who lives 2 hours away from here in a more populated portion of the state, somewhere I would deem safe compared to here. I called him up later that afternoon and explained my situation thoroughly. I could tell he didn't really understand, but was more than willing to have me come and stay with him for a few weeks. So I spent the next 3 weeks over at his house, mostly just trying to keep from coming back out of fear. I'd only gone back to my house about 2 or 3 times in the weeks, and it appeared that no extra damage had occurred. I finally began going back, and was finally now back full time. Nighttime was extremely eerie. No crickets or nothing. You could hear a pin drop outside, and feel just this evil around. However, I feel confident in saying that I never had to deal with these things afterwards. Sometimes it really upsets me that I don't know what to do about this. Sure, I have the proof of the damage, but it's not enough for anyone to believe it or hope to help me. It has yet increased my paranoia around strangers, and I'm constantly expecting them to show up at my house after dark. It even makes it hard to sleep at night. It feels as though these things wait until it knows that everybody else is asleep, and then tries their hardest to break in. And it took quite a while for me to be able to adjust going outside at nighttime without being completely scared out of my mind. I still feel nervous sometimes, but nothing like before. I've tried to do some researching as to what I'm dealing with here, and I have to be honest. I believe, after what I've read, that these are indeed paranormal entities of some kind. I know that it is most likely a skinwalker now, which at the time I did not, but these things are demons. They could take the shape of any animal or form they want. I guess they're said to be a witch like in nature, and they gain their power by sacrificing humans or animals. I've never done it, of course, but I feel it should be possible to kill it with fire. It seems that fire can purge or purify anything. I'm still not sure what these things are, other than just plain out terrifying. But at least now I think I know how to keep them away for good this time. If it does decide to come back around, well, I'll be ready. This encounter has stayed with me for so long. It even still feels surreal just talking about it. I guess it has mostly just given me a different perspective on life in general. It makes you wonder if there's more out there that we can't see. My brother and I love to camp. So, when he got his first car, we used that to explore the depths of the forest. There were many trails that went very far, and we've been doing this since we were little. But of course, now we've had the transportation to do what we wanted to do. We increased our boundaries and more. This particular time, our destination was a cabin, about 10 miles deep into the wilderness, but it felt like much more. That itself turned out to be a wild adventure. So, we set our sights on actually going to a different state and going to different forests and sections. On this occasion, my brother and I had gone exploring in the northern section of Pennsylvania, a period due to the lush landscape we had been wanting to camp out for a long time. And now, we finally got our chance. We had probably trekked out about 6 miles into the nearest trail and decided to call that camp. My brother and I had just made camp for the night, and we were getting ready to settle into our tents. We had the fire roaring, and were actually drying off our socks because we ended up stepping into some water that was deeper than we originally thought. I was busy stuffing a protein bar in my face while he was getting some water for the canteen. This was right around the very first moment we heard something strange off in the distance. Immediately, I recognized the noise as a voice that sounded familiar to my brother and I. I looked over at my brother, who was looking back at me, and we both kind of gave each other these puzzled looks as to what it was that we were both hearing. We looked back in the direction of the voice that we had heard, realizing this voice we were hearing, to our disbelief, was the voice of our deceased uncle. As we had heard our uncle's voice calling to us deeper in the forest, beyond the roar and light of the fire, deep in the distance behind where my brother and I were looking, there was a strange black figure, looming very far off into the woods, past the clearing but still visible. The hair on both of our necks stood on end. We had no idea why somebody would this be far out in the middle of nowhere, imitating the voice of our dead uncle. Did somebody who knew us follow us out here? How would they be able to perfectly imitate the voice of our dead uncle? I grabbed hold of my machete tightly, and my brother stood close by, as we watched this figure slowly come closer and closer towards the entryway. It began to sway back and forth, at which point I noticed just how tall this being actually was. It must have been somewhere around 8 feet. As we glanced over and observed this being more and more, we both realized this was anything but human. My mind raced for all things that could possibly be, but nothing added up. There are no bears that can stand on their hind legs like this, or look like this. When bears do stand up on their hind legs, they look like distinctly bears. This looked like a large person, but shaped very differently. My brother and I felt imminent danger, and we knew that whatever this being was complete trouble. This thing wasn't anything we could not handle with the tools we had on us, or so we thought, and it was very clear that this being or person was not afraid of us. I can't help but think of how much bigger this guy looked compared to my brother and I. We were both fairly young men, around 20 years of age. We weren't built like football players or anything. In fact, quite the opposite. My brother is a small guy, standing at maybe 5'5", weighing around 120 pounds soaking wet with his socks on. On the other hand, I'm somewhere around 6'1", a little bit heavier, but still very slender. This thing, we could both feel this immense power coming off of it. Its body language suggested dominance and complete unshakable confidence within itself. It began to approach us, taking step by step. It would take one step, pause, then another, then another. My brother and I motioned we should jump in the tent and stand guard. As we did this, the forest around us, filled with crickets and nightlife looming in, fell completely silent, and it began to grow increasingly dark very, very quickly. My brother and I sat there clutching our weapons, ready for the next thing that was going to happen, but nothing did. We sat there and we waited, and we waited, waiting for whatever person this was to approach us. After what felt like forever, I opened the tent flap and peeked outside. Our fire still roaring, and it was now a lot darker out. There's no way the sun could have gone down that quickly. It had been no more than 7 or 8 minutes since we first laid eyes on this person. Well, I couldn't hear it around or see it, but you could feel this eerie presence surrounding us. It felt like we were being watched. I was afraid to leave the light of the fire, in case whoever or whatever this was waiting. This thing, it didn't feel like a person at all. Something much bigger and much more powerful than anything I'd ever felt before. I knew this wasn't human. It wasn't exactly a spirit. It was something else entirely. Whatever this presence in the darkness was that we were feeling, we knew we couldn't just sit there and wait for it to move in on us. My brother was shaken up, especially having the memories brought back of our uncle, whom he was much more close with than I was. Were we being haunted? Was something happening like a ghost encounter? Were we being attacked by a demon? It was something none of us knew how to explain. This thing, whatever it was, felt like pure evil. It didn't feel like any man-made or natural evil I'd experienced in my life. We were dealing with the worst kind of evil you can imagine. Something most definitely paranormal. But my brother and I sat there, held our ground for as long as we could, just waiting for the night to end. We figured we would take shifts on staying awake just in case this thing decided it would come back and try to break in. I want to reiterate here that we had no idea what this was. The thought of this being some sort of supernatural entity didn't even cross my mind in the moment. I had never dealt with ghosts before or hauntings whatsoever. In fact, that topic was so far out from my day-to-day life. My senses were so heightened and I was full of adrenaline. I was ready for full-on war. I think I gripped my machete so hard, I probably caused blisters on my hands. After what felt like an eternity, both my brother and I waited for the sun to come up. After what seemed like forever, I noticed something odd. The wind had picked up, but it was dead silent. Only the slow crackling of the fire. Everything slowed down, including our breathing, and we sat there awake, guarding the tent. The next thing that happened made me feel sick to my stomach. It was extremely gentle, almost as if whoever this being was did not want to wake us, although we never fell asleep, which is why it came upon us during the night, maybe in hopes that it knew we would fall asleep, therefore being completely untouched and vulnerable. I heard something off in the distance. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but it came close, and I could tell they were heavy footsteps. The being didn't want us to wake, so it walked as quietly as possible. I could hear it trying to be quiet. So I held my breath, looking over at my brother, who I thought had heard it too. He also had stopped moving. Everything got really still again, almost like this thing, whoever or whatever it was, could read our minds and knew that we would sense something coming our way if we tried to get up and run. The next few moments felt like hours to me, even though I know there were only a few moments in reality, but time itself seemed frozen around this thing's presence that came upon us very suddenly. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, and when I turned, all I could see were the shadows dancing among the trees. What is this? Was this finally going to reveal itself? Was this its attempt to scout us out, so it can find the best way to strike? I looked at my brother and nodded towards the opening. We were going to make a run for it. We would have nothing to defend ourselves with outside the tent, but at least there was light out there, right? At that moment, I heard my brother gasp. He had seen something in his peripheral vision too. I turned my head completely around quickly, almost popping my neck, when I saw what he saw. What stood in front of us was not human nor animal. It did not even cast a shadow on the ground beneath it, even though there was a strong light source of fire. It looked human, but its skin was grayish, almost white and sickly, and its eyes were large and black. Its hands and feet were massive and kind of webbed, like maybe somebody had sewn weights onto them because they were disgusting looking. This thing looked starved and frail and skeletal on bits of its flesh. There was flesh at parts missing. It was in that very moment that our fight or flight senses had fully kicked in, and we didn't hesitate. We made a bolting run for it, going as fast as we could without wasting a second. We actually ran in the opposite direction of this thing, and unfortunately for us, deeper into the forest. Because this was so on a whim, we were not equipped with anything. We had no lights on us. All of our equipment and gear were left back at the campsite in the tent, and we're running aimlessly, sprinting off into the darkness, in fear, and can hear whatever this thing was begin chasing after us. If that didn't give us an extra boost of adrenaline, I don't know what would. All of a sudden, I felt like I was going 5 to 10 miles faster. Let me just explain something to you. This wasn't like somebody chasing after you in the woods. This sounded like a flipping football linebacker crashing through the woods, breaking down trees and small stuff. It was gaining on us, whatever it was. As we're running, and as we began to see light up ahead, it felt like we were going uphill, and the closer we got, the lighter it became, as if this was our end, and we would die in those woods. Who knows what would happen after that point? Maybe we would just stay lost forever. Perhaps it wasn't our time yet. The light turned out to be a campground, where there was somebody still awake at 2 a.m. standing by the fire pan, watching us sprint towards them, looking terrified. We finally reached camp and breathlessly told them what had happened. After telling the story, they kind of just looked at us silently, not saying a word. It was actually an older gentleman who seemed somewhat annoyed by our presence, but also slightly scared why we were running so hard. We were practically collapsing on top of one another and completely out of breath. What's also strange is whatever was chasing us had now completely stopped, that we were surrounded by this larger campsite, fully illuminated by lantern light and firelight. It's as if whatever had chased us wanted to stay completely out of the light, stay hidden in the darkness. The old man just took a deep breath and explained that there was this old abandoned insane asylum about 3 miles away from here that was left to rot in the early 1900s. It was apparently never demolished. He explained that he's been camping around these woods for a long time, and I guess there's a lot of strange activity, from weird voices to strange dark cloaked figures. A lot of demonic activity. That asylum has also been a hotbed for satanic rituals, exploration, and other things straight out of the dark realm. My brother and I just looked at each other, trying to comprehend what this guy is talking about. None of this was ever something we knew anything about. We just explained to him we're just trying to get out, and we'll come back to our campsite in the morning. We were wanting to know if whatever was chasing us, was there any connection to the insane asylum? But he didn't really answer. He explained that we're more than willing to stay in the campsite for the night and return in the morning. He handed both of us a cup of coffee and told us we would need it until the sun rose. He was a very strange man. As far as the rest of the night went, it was awful. Well, I can't say anything about what we learned about the insane asylum that is supposedly nearby where we were at. We did hear all the screaming and strange sounds not even 100 feet away from us all throughout the night. Like whatever this being was angry that it could not get to us because of the light. As I said, this man had at least 4 lanterns hung up all around his campsite, which would explain the bright light that we initially saw. I don't think this was more than a mile away from our own campsite. What I can say, though, is that whatever chased us certainly wasn't human. It was breathing hard and making what seemed like strange animal noises and huffs. Not to mention the fact that this thing sounded very heavy. Okay, I'm going to try and sum up what happened here during my experience, but first, let me explain something about myself. This story will seem strange to you, but I assure you, we experienced something not normal. After we spent more time talking to the man over the course of the night, we learned that there is a being called a Wendigo, supposedly a cannibalistic entity that feasts on human flesh. A being that was greatly feared by many of the native tribes. He believed that the real way to keep it from coming towards you, especially during the evening time, was to keep plenty of light around. It hated the light. We did not sleep at all that night, and by morning, we were exhausted. We said our goodbyes, and we made our way back to the campsite. Everything was torn up and destroyed. There really wasn't much left of our tent and our sleeping bags. They looked like they had been put into a shredder. Our equipment was broken and shattered. Flashlights snapped. And much of our supplies was thrown out everywhere and scattered. Everything was destroyed. We made sure to take what little energy we had left and get out of there, and not to return to this section of woods ever. I know that sounds crazy, but it's what it was. Now, let me explain something for you. This is the one and only time we have ever been camping in the northern sections of Pennsylvania. We usually try and do a lot of solo camping where we just go out together and spend about 5, 7, 8 days in isolation out in the woods. There's something about that style of camping that does really good for the human psyche. You become very intricately connected to nature. And while this was not the first time ever doing this for us, this was our first time encountering something this abnormal. We decided to put our heads together and try to do a little bit more research to see what we could uncover of this supposed Wendigo cryptid. What we learned about this being was quite disturbing. We tried to learn anything we could about an abandoned insane asylum. although we could not find much on it. My brother and I never actually went exploring for it, or found it ourselves. So for all we know, that old man could have been lying and making it all up. The only other connection I could really think that goes hand in hand with what we went through is that I know Pennsylvania has a very high amount of witchcraft. I don't know if the two coincide with what we saw and the satanic rituals, but it makes you wonder. After all of this, of course, we don't go camping in this section of Pennsylvania anymore at all. In fact, we don't even travel that far anymore. We stay more in southern Ohio, and more towards the east if we can. I still don't know much about cryptids or cryptozoology, or whatever you call it, or even Wendigos for that matter, and either does my brother. I don't really care. What we experienced was more frightful than I would ever want anybody else to experience. This, however, will not deter me and my brother from camping and enjoying ourselves out in nature like we love to do. In 2001, I moved to Kodiak, Alaska to become a pilot. I was excited about this pursuit. I would be able to see several beautiful places that I had never seen before. The first place that I visited in the area was a beach on a small island, not too far from Kodiak, where a sigil had been sighted. This was an animal sigil that had only been seen apparently once by a guy named Frank who lived around there and told people about it. The sigil had been almost completely washed away during the waves of the tide, but it still gave off a very dark presence when you were around it. The sigil, of course, wasn't necessarily scary, though. It was what happened after you saw it. The sigil kind of gave off this vibe that made you feel like if you didn't leave, something horrible would happen. I had heard about this sigil before. I'd even gone there, so I was expecting something pretty creepy. But seeing the sigil in person still gave me a very uneasy feeling because of how eerily accurate it looked compared to what I had heard about it. I, of course, had met Frank with myself and spent quite a bit of time talking to him about the sigil that appeared. He said to be very careful around it, that it attracted a dark energy you do not want to be anywhere around. He also then began asking me about Native American legends and lore. I asked him why. He explained to me that this sigil was put there by a Native American witch, also known as a shapeshifter. He asked me if I have ever heard the term skinwalker, and I had not. He explained to me that there were shapeshifters who possessed the power to wear whatever animal pelts they wanted, and they were able to shapeshift into those animals. This shapeshifter being was responsible for the sigil placed here, and if I was to go around it, looking at it, messing with it, or in any way disrupting its power flow, I would be invoking the wrath of darkness, or the skinwalker. I needed to be extremely careful. He said that this witch's eyes were on this thing at all times. He also went on to say that this sigil might be related to sigil sightings in the state of Utah, where there had been more hikers disappearing and more witches. I thanked him for all this information, but after mulling it over in my head for a couple of days, I decided that, you know what, Frank was just telling me these things because he wanted to scare people away from messing with it. The sigil that was carved into the side of this large rock seemed harmless enough, and all this talk about being spooky magic, well, maybe it was just that. So one day while I was up there, I decided to bring a few friends with me to take a look at it. We drove out there and were going to spend the day just hanging around, exploring. We brought food, drinks, etc. We were going to be hiking and exploring all around all day, and we finally made our way to the sigil near the end of the day. It was a gorgeous day, and we weren't able to get too close to the sigil, at least during the lower part of the day, due to the high tide that was coming in. But when we were finally able to get out there, we just stared at it for a while. My friends were joking around about all this weird sigil stuff, and one of my buddies dared me to go scratch on it with a rock. I couldn't help but remember what Frank had told me, that I should stay away from the sigil, and it would probably be very safe not to even touch it, let alone get close to it. My friends, of course, thought the entire thing was one big joke, and that I shouldn't even waste my time listening to old Frank. My buddy handed me a rock and said, "Dude, just go for it." I kid you not. Before I could even take a step over in the direction to do anything, You could literally feel the air around this thing change. Things got colder, the wind suddenly becoming harsher, and this unsettling feeling washing over us the same way tides came crashing in on the shore. It's like this presence just enveloped the entirety of the region. Even my friends noticed it. I saw the expressions on their face change from laughing to a serious one. Some of them were already looking around as I was the source of this change in atmosphere. My one friend grabs my hand with a rock in it and says, maybe this isn't such a good idea after all. We should probably just go. Bad. The friend who handed the rock said, nah, let's do it. He grabs the rock from my hand and briskly walks over to the sigil, which was now only roughly about 25 feet away from us in the sand. The sigil was carved on a large rock that was sitting on the shoreline. My friend walks up to the sigil and, without hesitating further, throws and chucks the rock right at it. I saw it hit the sigil, and as soon as that happened, this deep growl, this guttural sound pierced all throughout the woods all around us, so loud it would have made your ears bleed if they weren't stopped up because of how deafening this was. My friends look around even more frantically than before for where this sound might have been coming from, while me, I was staring right at the sigil, trying to figure out what direction the sound had come from. And it sounded like there were multiple sounds moving towards us now very quickly from the woods. We all stopped and began frantically looking around again at the source of the noise that was now quickly coming after us. It reminded me of an army approaching through the woods in our direction. And my friend, who stood on the shoreline, who had just thrown the rock, looked scared crapless. His face was white, and all the woods behind us were waiting for something to come. It sounded like many large things coming in our direction. We just glanced over at each other and said, now would be a good time to leave. I don't think we've ever ran so fast in our lives. We all took off running towards the car with these sigil-covered woods chasing us, like some demon-possessed forest. It was like something out of Evil Dead. It sounds ridiculous, but that's what it was. I'm not sure what or who was coming after us. None of my friends would stop me to ask. They just kept running until we all got in the car. And I think we piled in faster than ever have, like a clown car. And we drove out of there. It wasn't even funny. All of us were freaking out, asking what was going on. All the usual questions that you would probably ask in a situation like this one. The rest of the time was just frantic chatter and fear. Even that night, as things calmed down, we had our own, more frightening experiences in the cabin. That night in the cabin was one of the most terrifying nights that I'll never forget. I mean, we had already had weird stuff happening in the woods. But for some reason, that night at the cabin was just pure insanity. We did not go to sleep right away, thinking that if these demonic spirits wanted us dead, they would have killed us by now. I can safely say, though, after what happened that night, it made me feel like the demonic power we had somehow invoked was coming back to haunt us. We were all still very shaken up from the day and tried our best to lay down and relax, to try and forget about all the craziness that had happened. I would like to sit here and tell you that we were calmly relaxing, trying to fall asleep. But you don't just simply fall asleep, not after a day like this. The events of this night started roughly at about 10:30 p.m. This is when the first sounds were heard. These were like howling noises, not like a wolf, but much, much deeper. And they were joined in by more of them, and more. And they became extremely loud, and very apparent they were angry. And those soon turned into snarls and growls, as if they were a large chorus of bears and wolves. I remember my friends and I all looking at each other, trying to comprehend that, is this really happening? Are we all hearing and experiencing the same thing, or is this just some mass hallucination? We were all completely sober, nobody had drank, no drugs, nothing. Those screaming sounds and howling, of course, grew now closer to the cabin, where it began to almost turn into this demonic chanting and yelling. We would hear things like rocks and stones being thrown to the cabin, loud tree knocks and all such, frightening noises all throughout the night. We had a gun with us, but we really doubt that would do us any good against the forces of evil. It was obvious at this point we had clearly invoked a demonic force by messing with that sigil. We kept hearing the chanting, the screaming, the laughing, everything in between. It was so incredibly scary, we couldn't say anything. How could you even describe such a horrible experience? It felt like the night would go on forever, but it would eventually pass as ours bled through like minutes from the tormenting noises. The following day, we were just glad we made it, and all the sounds and activity had totally now subsided, at least with the sun rising up. None of us had even bothered to step out of the cabin again for fear of what might come, until probably noon the following day. We waited until the sun was in the middle of the sky pointing down, illuminating everything. Even the morning sun wasn't safe enough, or so we felt. Completely amped from panic and just completely wiped by fear. When we stepped out, we were also more scared by what we found. The same sigil that was carved into that rock was now written all over our cabin. And not just written, but carved into the wood, as if somebody had some sort of blade or something to carefully craft this sigil into the wood. It was also all over the trees and the ground, and some new ones as well. Something I want to add in real quick, that we also, when we saw this, we left as soon as possible. But we all experienced some pretty severe symptoms of sickness and disease after this. I'm purposefully keeping the names of all my friends that were involved out of this, just as an FYI. One of my friends with us during this ended up almost dying in the ER and getting severe kidney failure within 2 weeks of this happening. I, myself, ended up getting severe flu symptoms for 3 weeks following these events. I experienced terrible body aches and chills, all the usual symptoms, but I just kept vomiting. I was concerned I'd have to go to the hospital. I could not keep water down, but eventually came out of it. The one friend who threw the rock on the sigil developed stage 2 stomach cancer roughly 60 days after this had happened. And my other friend who was involved, both his parents had passed away within 3 months of this event in a very horrific car accident. Of course, this could all just be one large coincidence, but if you look at the nature of black magic, it probably wouldn't take a lot to realize we were cursed. We were marked. We had been hexed for messing with the sigil. I've been pretty messed up since this happened. It's not like as soon as I got better from the sickness, I was A-okay. I've been stricken with constant anxiety attacks, nightmares of demons, night terrors, and all other sorts of chronic nausea that seems to be a common theme in my life following this event. It seems to be getting better slowly by slowly, but it's still very persistent in my life for the last 20 years. Unfortunately, the only way it seems to get better is to distance yourself from people and places that remind me of this event. I want to make sure this is clear. I was not the one who threw the sigil, even though I'm usually blamed for it. But what reason would anybody else have if not me? If everyone had these symptoms, and they could see my other friends who were sick or have died after this event, they know there's more to it than just a coincidence. For those reading this, do not toy with occult magic. I can't stress enough that our actions were stupid, and if you decide to mess around with things like this because you don't believe it exists, you are truly playing with fire. We must remember at any given moment, our time could come, and we do not want to be careless. We should live every day as if it were our last. Nobody knows what is going to come next. I'm going to go ahead and end this story here. It's been a long time since I've tried to write something like this out, so I hope you all enjoyed it, or at least got something out of my horrible experience. I'm running into you because I want to talk about my own running in with a shapeshifter. I was a young man back then, running a truck full of nets and a few traps through a part of Arizona that I remember as kind of sandier than the rest. Truck had seen better days, of course, even if it had been a gift from my uncle. I like to consider myself a guy that would try and track down skinwalkers near Flagstaff. It's a tricky thing to catch, unless you know its tricks. But I feel luck had sided with me, rather than against me that day out on Highway 77, outside Winslow. I remember a dog encaged in the back, a black lab. I had bought it from a breeder to keep me company when nobody was around, but also because I knew the Skinwalker hunted people. 2 months later, you can't even tell it came with me, other than its willingness to sit in the passenger seat while I drove. That's when I see something that looked like a man, or at least a skeleton wearing what looked like clothes that went out of fashion about 8 decades ago, standing out on a stone, probably 60 yards out. I wasn't sure what it was at first, so I called to it, and then it turned to look at me. Every muscle and fiber of my being tensed up instantly as I just see these yellow glowing eyes and a skeletal face staring back at me. I knew deep down in my core what I was dealing with was entirely paranormal. This was a Navajo skinwalker, a shapeshifter. It quickly stood up, and I felt every part of my being telling me I needed to leave now, as this thing slowly began walking in my direction. I had a .45 with a full clip of silver bullets on a hip holster, a net across the truck seat, and a few steel traps in a box behind me, and a double-barrel shotgun. I just went for my sidearm, as everything told me to go ahead and shoot this thing before it's torn into my car or ripped out my throat. The Navajo skinwalkers have been around since at least American expansion westward, up to their genocide by European settlers. They can shift into almost any animal, except for maybe like a frog or a housefly. I mean, why would they want to? They're mostly violent, but some people say they're only violent if they're actually provoked. So I aimed my .45 right at this thing and took a shot. And I realized a silver bullet isn't going to kill it. They're pretty hardy. The skinwalker supernaturally dove for cover and missed it, like a lizard would when it's dawned on me that this thing is basically a superhuman. I didn't want to die out in the desert, so I realized I was unmatched, flooring it to my uncle's house. For half an hour, all I can hear is this weird warbling noise on the wind behind me, even with all the windows rolled up. Once I finally got within shouting distance of my family home, I saw them come running out with shotguns as my truck bounced its way into the driveway. I remember dust floating around me like a second cloud of smoke that had magically appeared once they fired their first round of buckshot into the dirt track. I had made this driveway from where the thing was standing by a rock about a mile from here. I was a little too shaken up to share a single detail about what happened with them, but a few nights later, when a coyote came into the yard, they told me that a pack of them had been showing up more and more during the day, all around the compound we live on, so I might want to keep a lookout. I think it was the skinwalker who had now targeted me coming back to me. I don't exactly know how skinwalkers work, but I do know they will target people. I would call what I did pointing a weapon at this thing completely foolish and probably made myself a target. Even though I like to consider myself a skinwalker hunter, I probably shouldn't. I mean, it's not like I've ever killed one. Ever since this has happened, we have seen a huge increase in coyotes on our property, and all other sorts of strange behavior. I'm a little jumpy now when a coyote howls at night. A little more jumpy when I see a dog stand outside, barking, and a lot more edgy around a full moon, knowing these things will operate in packs, and more horrifying, they will disguise themselves as a part of the pack to get in close to your house. I saw something crouched outside my window one night, but I can't exactly explain what it was. But I have a hint being out here in Arizona that it might actually be a skinwalker. I'll tell you my story, and I'll let you be the judge. Here's what happened a few years back when I was a little younger, living in a modest single-level home with my father. At the time, I had a room that looked out into a backyard, which is pretty much a desert since we live close to a reservation and it stretches for miles. I was sitting at my computer one night, browsing whatever because it's what kids do nowadays instead of playing outside or talking to girls, when something outside catches the corner of my eye. I look up from typing on this old keyboard and see a creature crouched down beside a tree, looking right at me through the glass. It was not human at all, but it also didn't quite look animal either. It had this large head with long arms that were segmented, almost like fingers. But instead of hands, it had what looked like 2 long claws. The arms were definitely longer than what you would expect on a person, and it had this really pointy spine sticking up behind its head. I'm not sure how tall it was because it was crouched down, but if it stood up, it wouldn't have been much taller than me, at the time, which was about 5'10". I remember being frozen in fear as I watched this thing just staring right back at me, with these deep black eyes that seemed to be sunken into its face. It did not blink or flinch, or show any other signs of immediate life, aside from the slow breathing through its wide, flared nostrils. At last, I snapped out of it, slamming my laptop shut and running to my room, jumping under the blankets. I'm not sure how long I was out, but when I woke up, it was morning, and the sun was already high above us. My father worked construction at the time, so he wasn't even home for God knows how many hours, which was fine, because by that point, I didn't want to leave my room without him there, or at least a baseball bat or something. I tell you this story because it gives me chills today, to think of all those times that we had guests over, and they used our bathroom that faces the backyard and never knew what was lurking outside, potentially watching them. This changed me forever as a kid, and now as an adult. Whenever I go out into the desert, I always wonder if I'm being watched, and it's too bad I did not have a camera with me back then. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that what I saw was a skinwalker. I'll tell you what I saw, and you can tell me what you think. This is going to sound ridiculous, and I would have never believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. But here we go. I was walking my dog on the trail behind my house at night, like 12 a.m. exactly. My dog likes to bark for no reason around that time, and always wakes me up. So, I'm always looking out the window to make sure there's nothing before she gets too loud. And then he starts barking. But it's not really a bark, more of a quieter bark, I guess. Like a woof noise. So I decide to walk him on the trail instead of using on his leash in front of my house, where something might be out there scaring him. So, we get on the trail start. He stops pretty quickly to lift his leg on a tree, so I'm waiting for him to finish. Something catches my eye. It's coming from the wooded area behind my house, and it looks super tall, like 7 feet at least. It had grayish skin with long arms and didn't appear to be wearing clothes. Not sure if this is strange, but at the time, I was less surprised by it. It looked like hair, but also seemed like scales from where I was. I wasn't sure how else to describe it, because at the time, I was picturing those armless lizards that looked dry and scary. It walked kind of hunched over, almost sideways, like a gorilla, only weirder. It was weird, and it seemed very tall compared to my dogs. But something was really weird about it. It had this face like it was kind of annoyed or angry at me for seeing it. Like everything else about it just seemed careless. But the face, it looked totally aware of my existence, but also mad. It made me feel bad, like I wasn't supposed to see this. I don't know how else to describe it, except maybe if you've ever seen Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. You know when they make faces where their eyebrows are all aggro and contracted. It felt super powerful. My whole body tingled, and I felt really weak. Like it wasn't trying to hurt me, but something about its face made me feel like it could have if it wanted to. But then I thought, maybe there are bears in this area that look weird because, well, maybe they're mangy or something. So I peeked through the trees expecting to see a bear or something, and it's gone. It was way too tall to have been hiding behind the tree, so I started walking back home because I'm not interested in finding out what else lives out there at night. My dog walked with me perfectly fine though, so unless she was scared of it too. I don't want to seem dumb, so please don't judge me for sharing this. But it happened and I don't know why. What do you think it was? Do you think it's real or made up, and what could it be? I've been trying to rationalize what I saw for a while now, but there's nothing I could possibly conclude of what it would be. The idea or notion of a werewolf It just seems ridiculous. I can't deny that based on the description of what I saw, it matches everything to the T. This was 2016. I was at my friend's house, which is about an hour away from the closest city. His house is also right next to a large forest. It gets pretty dark there, at around 9 p.m. at this time of year. I spent the night there because we were going to head out for breakfast in the morning with his parents. I remember waking up just after 2 a.m., and I heard strange sounds coming from the direction of the front door. It sounded like somebody or something, what I assumed was an animal, scratching their nails against hardwood floors really fast and hard. At first, I thought my friend maybe had woken up and maybe was doing something. But when I looked outside my window towards his room, he wasn't there. In fact, everybody was fast asleep in the house. But I woke up my friend's dad and told him about the strange sounds coming from outside. He went outside to check for us and was gone for 10 or so minutes. When he came back in, we were both really confused. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary outside. It sounded like somebody was scratching their nails, actually. And when I told my friend about the strange encounter that happened when I came back home, he said that something strange had been happening over at his house too. His dad even brought in a priest to bless the whole house for protection. Pretty strange if you ask me. That night seemed unusually dark, now that I think about it. When I was 17, I had one of the most horrific experiences with my life, with something I never thought would actually exist, but does. I was home alone. The first thing I'd like to say is that the only reason you're getting this story is because somebody said it wasn't real, and I believe them more than my own memories. Because of their disbelief, they made me feel stupid for saying something so outlandish, but never once did it ever cross their mind that some people actually do believe these things. One night, after work, I had some time to kill before meeting up with some friends downtown. This was also in 2005. I stopped by our local grocery store, just off the res. It was still pretty early into the evening, and there was hardly anybody else around. As soon as I pulled into the parking space close to the front of the store, I noticed a tall black figure just standing next to one of those big road construction barrels. I remember thinking it was kind of odd, and it gave me a bit of an uneasy feeling. Never once did I think that what I saw was real until it began coming towards me. About halfway across the parking lot, this being looked down at my vehicle and then locked its gaze on me. Instantly, all thoughts about it being a person wearing a really tight-fitting Halloween costume went out the window. Once we made eye contact, I felt like everything around me was spinning, and stars were going in and out of my vision, as if I was going to pass out. But only for a couple of seconds, though. I began to shake uncontrollably, but only for the first couple of minutes. After that, I was fine and very confused. For some reason, I couldn't make myself put my truck in reverse and back up all the way out of the parking spot. It's like my feet were frozen. At that point, it was nearly halfway across the lot again. Something didn't feel right. As soon as it got close to my vehicle, I remember thinking, what if this thing tries to attack me through my window? So, once it got within about 10 to 12 feet away from my truck, I threw all my weight on top of the gas pedal and sped backwards really fast. This way I could get out of there. I checked all around everywhere on the vehicle. Nothing. I decided to look around the parking lot, go inside the store and ask if anybody had seen anything or knew what it was. As I turned back towards my truck, I saw the thing taking off across the parking lot with an unusual-looking lope-type gait, like a cross between a person running really fast and one of those big loping animals, like a horse. It ran right across my path as if it didn't care whether or not it got hit. After that point, I noticed quite a lot of people all around town talking about this thing. And for about 3 years, I never went on the reservation after dark alone. But at night, when everybody else was out driving around on their way home from work, I'd sit in my vehicle, make sure all the doors were locked, while shaking. My mother explained to me that some people say it's one of them, up to no good. She also said there are lots of stories about coyotes and can change into other things, even people. The only reason she mentioned this was because these days, they're always coming around, asking for food and stuff, since our economy is so bad right now. Not once did anybody ever laugh at me or tell me what I saw wasn't real. And believe me, if I had seen Sasquatch or something, everybody around here probably would have made fun of me. Their reaction had convinced me that what I saw was real. There's a lot more to the story, though. When my parents had come over for a visit, about a few years ago, one of my brothers told them all about these new words he learned while working on cars at a local garage with his friends. And when they'd talk about these things, I asked him where he heard of such things like skinwalkers and stuff. I knew they weren't talking about breaking and entering, since we don't do stuff like that. He told me all about the show that he had watched from way back when, called Joe Rogan Questions Everything, and how the host of that show had some really cool friends who hunt these creatures all around the world. They told me about skinwalkers and all that stuff. Bigfoots, chupacabras, Mothmen. Also said that they're not folklore at all. They're real, living flesh and blood creatures out there in the forests and wherever else. Well, to this day, I still have a fear for when it gets dark outside. Call me crazy, but I know skinwalkers are real. You want to know how I know that? I've always just thought they were some nonsense myth, but 3 years ago, I had a run-in with one of these things myself. And let me tell you, they are no joke. These things are pure evil. I was in a Navajo part of Arizona. I don't know the name, but I do know that skinwalkers and all other kinds of evil things come from here. It was like 10:30 at night, and we were camping in my friend's backyard with permission, of course, and we heard this crap loud of noise coming from behind us. We went to go check it out and see these two dark figures running down the hills towards us. We thought they were deer. It had been raining so much that when they got up close enough to our flashlight, we saw them for what they really were. Skinwalkers. They stood up on two legs and began making weird noises, screaming and uttering sounds, whatever you want to call it. We realized that these things are extremely territorial, so do not go onto their land at night. I'm from northern Utah myself, and about 2 years ago, me and my friends were also camping up in the mountains above a Navajo res. We had also been there before and nothing had happened, but this time, we heard these noises, screaming. We didn't know it was a skinwalker at the time, so we disregarded it, for the most part, until one of our friends told us about these things. It sounded exactly like what we had heard. So now I swear by every story ever written that these things are real and very dangerous. You don't want to mess with skinwalkers at all. If you're out camping and you hear noises, run. Get off their land. Do not go on their land at night. If you see one, do not make eye contact. And most certainly, do not follow it. These things are psychopaths. They will kill you if given the opportunity. I've seen what they can do to people. These I was visiting some friends in northern Arizona, and we had the most wild night of our lives. It was like a nightmare come to life. We were all hanging out in the living room, with 2 of us on a sofa and 2 more on a recliner, watching a movie. And suddenly, our dogs start barking like crazy from the hallway that led to the bedroom. The wall was about head height from me, so we could only see what they were looking at by having them stand up on their hind legs and look over. All 4 of us saw this huge walking canine thing walking around just outside the house. It had a very upright walking gait and was almost as tall as the doorway between both rooms. We all freaked out. This is not something you want to encounter when there's one door separating you. We didn't know exactly what it was, but I started looking around the side of the wall to see its dark silhouette in the window. We all got up to see what it was. I could not believe my eyes when I looked out the window. It looked in at us from about 5 feet away, with these reddish-orange eyes through a head that I can only sort of describe as being shaped like an upright canine skull, short hair on the top, from shoulder height down to its 2 legs. They were also covered in short hair or fur, just like on its head. The shoulders were clearly human-shaped. We didn't have any flashlights or anything. The best way I can describe it is if you took a man's upper body, put it on 4 legs, and added some clawed hands instead of paws, a dog head, and red eyes. I really wish we had recorded this encounter with our phones, but the shock left us with no chance to think of anything in time. We stayed inside for what felt like an hour after it went away, too scared to even make a move or make any noise. That was definitely one of the most terrifying things I've seen, and neither me nor anybody else has ever heard of skinwalkers before, so that makes me wonder, could whatever being this is have been a skinwalker? After this, I reached out to a relative of mine who's lived in New Mexico most of her life. She's now in her later 50s. She actually told me a few terrifying accounts with these things after sharing my experience and stressed to me just how real these things are. She told me they can just outright take over and change your body, and that her own grandmother had even had an account of these things trying to come into her home, trying to get into her room. Another relative of mine told me once she saw a skinwalker taking the form of a deer right before her. These things are extremely real, scary, and dangerous if you ever meet one. She told me about when she was younger and she would see these things, but she said it's not something you typically see anymore. Navajo have become hyper aware of them and are now doing practices to ward them off. She said that they would never tell outsiders about them, and that these things will do everything in their power to stay hidden. The Navajo apparently even have a long history of making pacts with dangerous non-human entities for power or protection. So, if the skinwalker legends come from those type of interactions, it's dangerous to assume that you can talk about it. I think this goes without saying, but I want to be clear. Don't mess around with skinwalkers or try playing games with them. They can just as easily turn into something dangerous that's much stronger than you and kill you. Even worse, they might take control of your body and steal your soul. Also, do your research before you try and find these things. A lot of accounts I've heard are usually very dangerous and can make you go crazy if you don't know how to deal with them. It's been 6 or so years since my encounter with the Wendigo, and since then, I have a hard time going into the woods by myself. I'm always scared and I'm freaked out by what may happen. This experience has left me terrified of being alone. I developed a really bad anxiety from it all. Anyway, enough about me. I will say that before this, I didn't believe Wendigos were even a thing. I thought they were just some online creepypasta designed to scare people. How wrong I was. On this day, I went out into the woods with my friends on a camping trip. I just got out of college and was looking forward to enjoying nature, some much-needed time off. We spent the day hiking, cooking some leftover food over the fire, and having an amazing time. It started getting dark, so we decided it would be best to head back to our campsite before nightfall fully hit. On our way back, my friend saw something moving in the distance behind us, deep into the forest towards where we came from earlier that day. There were 4 of us at this point. Me, my friend who first saw the creature, his girlfriend, and his older brother. At first, we thought it was just some wild animal, but then we heard it making some strange noises, like a bear, but the noises were too loud and sounded too angry. Then, we slowly saw the creature moving closer through the trees towards us. We were all terrified, fleeing back to the campsite. They led the way, and I followed closely behind. We got back to sight, and this thing I believe was still chasing after us, until we finally closed and locked our car doors. It didn't stop following us, though. We could see its eyes glowing in the shadows from between our rearview mirror. Me and all of us were screaming like hell now because of how much this thing was coming after us. And we drove for about 15 minutes straight before stopping at the nearest gas station for finally calming down. Weeks after this incident, we were scared of Wendigos, but I myself tried my best to keep everybody calm and still claim that Wendigos don't exist. It was only until recently that she believed me. However, on the other hand, my other friend won't even go camping with us anymore. He's too scared. I've tried to do a lot of online researching about what these things are and all. I'm finding information on cannibals and how these things just want to eat the flesh of their victims. I'm not exactly sure why they eat flesh, but the only Wendigo story I've found is one about a Wendigo that wants to eat corpses. I think this Wendigo might have been a lost soul of somebody who died before. I mean, after all, we don't know. I don't know for sure, but it's the only thing I can come up with at this point. From now on, whenever I go camping with friends, I always make sure to bring something that I can protect myself with. Thanks for reading. I was hiking up in the northern woods in Canada, trying to look for waterfalls. It was on this hiking expedition that I ran into what I believe was a Wendigo. It was around 3 a.m., and I was about to fall asleep, so I decided to do my business, make my way back to camp. I had my Wapiti hound with me. It was still dark out, but I could see fine. I was digging a hole when I heard something running on all fours behind me at an alarming speed. Then, the Wapiti hound let out this high-pitched whine and sounded like she knew oblivion was coming. As soon as this happened, there was nothing left of her but her collar. This creature had consumed her. The hound's name was Lily, and I have never been able to find a dog quite like her since. I'm just glad I escaped with my life. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been there to see that thing coming towards me. I may not be here today had that dog not been there to buffer. I was lucky, I guess. I ran as fast as I could for a few miles until I finally got the nerve to look behind me. I didn't see anything, but I could still hear its breathing when I'm in my tent alone at nighttime. This happened in eastern Texas. I was only 15. I was spending the summer with my grandparents in Texas. I got a paper route. I had to get up super early to deliver papers, so I would just ride my bike until I couldn't see any houses. This happened during June and July, when it was still dark out. Anyway, one morning, I'm riding along and I hear something behind me. I look back and I see this big, dark furred animal, kind of loping. I can only see it from the waist up, and I'm not sure if this should have been more scared on how fast it was running, or that I couldn't tell what the heck it was. I could only make out large forearms and its head like a dog. I began pedaling as fast as I could, but all this thing did was accelerate, and I saw those huge paws come down right next to my foot, and I stopped looking back. I didn't stop pedaling until I got home, and the scariest part about this is nobody believes me. It's like my mom thinks it's probably just some big coyote. The ranch we lived on was about 5 to 6 miles out of town, and I see him all the time, and this was no coyote. But I know I saw something. I don't even know what's going on anymore. Was this a dogman or a skinwalker? I'm an avid outdoorsman. I've seen plenty of animals in the wild, but I'll never forget this night. I'm still iffy about telling stories like this, but I had to share it with somebody. There was a time when I was younger. I went out hunting near the national park back home. I grew up around that whole region my whole life. I know pretty much every inch of that forest. One thing you should know about me is I'm also very good at moving quietly through the woods. I don't even go hunting anymore because sometimes I feel like it's too easy. Anyway, we decided to break off from our group and move on to some deer trails where there wasn't many people going through, because deer are smart, I guess. I had my sister's German Shepherd with me. We called her Scout. She's a good dog. We walked for about an hour. Well, I was walking. I let her run ahead of me. I didn't want her to get stuck in the brush while I moved on. I had about a mile or so on us when I heard commotion up ahead, and saw what sounded like a herd of deer going through the woods. Probably more than 5. They were all running fast, and it sounded like they were making quite a bit of noise coming through the brush. So, being curious as I am, I decided to follow them. I called Scout to heel. I didn't want them scaring the deer. I heard something else in front of me, so I decided it'd be best to take out my rifle and get ready. That's when I see this tall, dark figure running through the woods. I couldn't make out what it was, but it appeared to be like a tall man wearing a cloak of some kind. I called Scout up ahead and followed him because he seemed very determined on whatever this thing was that we were chasing. I could see the silhouette again, only roughly 50 yards away. By then, I had made up my mind. I was not going home without finding what or who this was. It stopped running. Scout did too, and started growling at it, and making little protective barks. I stopped, did not see anything, and I was about to turn back when I saw it. It was tall, turned its head and looked at me, and I felt the coldest chill go down my spine. I couldn't move, only stare into the eyes of this being. Its face was darker than any animal I'd ever seen at night. It had no fur on its long, thin limbs. Its hands were human, but with 10-inch claws that glistened under the moonlight. The eyes stuck out the most. They were yellow, kind of gold. They locked onto mine. Then it charged. I was shook up and I fired several rounds at this thing before Scout came out of nowhere and charged. I knew I hit it. I saw a couple of shots break into it, and Scout was a good 30 feet ahead of me, jumping down on this thing. I watched as this creature grabs hold of my best friend by the neck, and with one hand throws him into a tree. I hear the wet snapping sound of bones, and I run about 100 yards back before I turn around. When I turned around, Scout got up, limping back to me, and this beast had disappeared. I never gave up on looking for whatever it was that I knew I hit. I smelt it too. I could smell its blood all over. Unfortunately, Scout would pass away later that night due to the injuries sustained. I was out cutting wood with a friend of mine in northern Minnesota. We came across a very large, unusual humanoid figure right at dusk one evening. I had my Win Magnum rifle with me, and we both began getting nervous. We were still several hundred yards away from it. I didn't want to take my rifle off of it just yet, in case I needed to drop it quick. It was laying flat on its stomach, propped up on its elbows, looking into the woods that we just walked through only moments before. I couldn't exactly see any facial features other than huge pointed ears. I was worried it hadn't seen us, though. I don't know how. I moved a little closer just to be safe, and then I saw why my friend was even more nervous. This shape began morphing into this monster. I stayed as still as I could, hoping it would never hear or smell us either. But I knew I couldn't wait any longer to make a move if we wanted to survive. When I made up my mind to shoot, it began running straight at us at about 50 to 60 miles an hour, with the most hideous roar scream imaginable. I barely got off a shot with it coming towards me at full speed. Only clipped its upper left shoulder area, which stopped it for a few seconds as I was trying to chamber another round as I ran for my life. I made it into the brush as I put another round through its upper shoulder and finally got a good headshot on it. I think. I'm unsure if I killed it or not, but I don't see it anymore, so I hope I did. I don't know what kind of flipping predator I dealt with out there, but I have no desire to deal with it again. I got away with a very small scratch that I still have on my leg from it, although I can't be certain what will happen. I'm not sure what I killed or what I think I killed in those woods, but this wasn't your regular animal. The worst part about this whole thing was after I shot it, I didn't even get to look at how big it really was. I just ran. Even though we were only about 40 yards away when I put that third round into its left shoulder, and then thank God, we both ran like deer. The creature began screaming again, and I heard it chasing us through the brush for about 30 seconds before we finally made our way out of there. I have a story about two experiences that I had in northern Michigan, one near Gwyn and the other near Ironwood. The first time I saw what could be described as a Wendigo, I was 16 years of age, fishing with my grandfather at night, way down along the southeast part of Messick, around 10 o'clock. We were catching pike off the dock when I got spooked and told my grandfather I think I just saw a Wendigo. I had seen something white running along the tree line. I was very young and had never heard of a Wendigo at the time, but I knew what I had seen wasn't normal. It had to be some sort of creature or something, I told him. That's all I knew. It wasn't human. It moved way too fast for any man I know. The next day, we were eating breakfast with my family, and I told them about seeing what I thought was a ghost on our fishing trip. My dad, of course, said the only thing out there would have been an old trapper by the name of Fred. He went crazy out there hunting for wolves back in the 30s, and he was also known to kind of be crazy. You might see him out there. I should go out there tonight. I know I did not imagine that thing. Well, later that night, at about 11:30, I went down to the dock that we used behind my grandmother's house. I didn't even make it the whole way down before I saw it again. And I knew I couldn't leave until I proved myself right. So I stayed and watched this thing run around on all fours and then stand up, walk, and then run again across the field. When I saw it stand up and walk on two legs, I knew what I was looking at. I at least knew that this thing was not human. It had to be a Wendigo. After watching him for about an hour, he disappears back in the forest. Scared out of my mind by what I seen, I ran all the way home without looking back once. The next morning, as we were eating breakfast, like we always do every morning, my brother, who is very into ghosts, told me that there used to be this old abandoned house on those woods. People said they would hear screaming in the middle of the night. I guess one guy who lived right across from those woods said something was moving around his house late at night, throwing rocks at his windows and doors, shouting at the house. My brother said they moved because it wanted the people who lived there gone. Now, my second experience with this creature happened also in northern Michigan, in Ironwood. It was also right around 10 o'clock. I went out on a camping trip with some friends of mine. We were all sitting around the fire telling stories when one of my friends told us about an encounter he had where he experienced the Wendigo. This friend explained how him and his girlfriend at the time were driving back from visiting her uncle and aunt. They also live in that same area, and they got jumped by something they initially thought was some guy trying to rob them, but that their car wouldn't start, so they decided to walk. As they're looking down by the river, alongside of the road, there was something digging around under their car, so they both walked over to find out what it was. What he didn't know is that creature had crawled into the engine block, or at least under it, and shut off the car by pulling on wires and destroying parts. This way, the car could not run. As he got closer to this thing, it came running out from under the vehicle, and what my friend said he saw scared him half to death. This thing was like half man, half deer, half goat. Scared for their lives, they both ran back to the highway where somebody had finally stopped to see if they were okay. When they told this man that what they had saw, he just laughed at them and said, "It was just a Wendigo. You need to go home now." Scared out of their minds, the couple got in somebody else's car and drove all the way back into town. They finally found a place that would let them stay the night, even if that had been after hours, so they stayed there until morning, shaken up by what they had seen. Of course, that's not really my second encounter, so I guess this is technically my second encounter. That was just another part of the story. Well, this happened one winter, around January or February, on my mom's side of the family. It was actually a camping trip, where me and my little brother were around 10 years old at the time. We put on some new snow gear, picked up our rifles for this hunting trip, and hitched a ride with my cousins to the cabin. This is where we're going to be hunting, about an hour or so, freezing our butts off in the car. We finally get there, and once again, the people who own the cabins told us something terrible had happened here last night. Scared beyond our wits because none of this sounded good, Even worse when they explained what had happened. It really did sound like an attack. An attack I would learn that would later be done by a Wendigo. The people said that one of their kids from another marriage was staying at the cabin when she apparently got attacked by a creature. There were claw marks all over her face and body. It looked like she had been mauled by a bear, and this thing had also broken in the house and attacked her. She had run out into the middle of the road in -40, screaming at the top of her lungs, when somebody finally drove by to see what all the fuss was about. She explained that something had drug her back into the cabin and was trying to kill her. Not long after, my little brother decided we were going to go check things out, and maybe hunt down whatever did this. But before we could do anything else, these 2 police officers pulled up asking us where the problem was out here, and if they were ready to help us. So, long story short, they had no idea who or what did this, just that it apparently looked human, but acted inhuman, which sounds exactly like a Wendigo attack. Scared out of our wits, my brother and I ran back to the cabin where we were sleeping. We had no idea what was going to happen or what we should do. A few hours after the first officers arrived, another couple showed up asking who was staying here tonight, and if anybody else had seen anything unusual like this before, asking if any of these cabins were rented out for the week, or if somebody was staying here, and they might have seen anybody coming in or out of this cabin with weird clothes, hair color, or anything that would set them apart from everybody else. Scared by these strange questions, afraid they might be trying to find somebody who looks like me, I stayed quiet. But it turns out, one of my cousins was staying at the cabin. He wasn't there when all this happened, and everything went down. But his friend went running for help after seeing what had happened, so apparently, the Wendigo looked exactly like him. Red hair and green eyes. Yes, it's true. These beings can take shape of anybody you know. They are indeed shapeshifters. Be very careful. My experience with the paranormal began when I was just a young kid. I have been able to see ghosts from a very early age and began seeing them more often when I turned about 8. This is when strange things started happening in my house. Lights flickering on and off, the TV channels changing, turning off by itself, and doors opening and closing. When we were there watching movies, I would turn around, and there would be a strange man standing behind me, looking down at me with red eyes. My father's Jamaican, and the people there believe the spirits of their ancestors will watch over them when they die. It scared me into my wits. I didn't tell anybody except my mother, but she didn't believe in ghosts, so she told me to stop making up stories. When I was 11, strange things began happening outside my house. Strange noises, voices, feelings of being watched. Of course, my parents never believed me, even though my father's background. I told them what I had seen and heard, and now they regret it, because things have severely escalated. I'm now 19, and a few years ago, things began happening in my room like something touching me. Even worse when I was little. Calling my name and other bizarre movement. But it got so bad I could not sleep at night anymore. So, for 3 months straight, every night, the darkness would consume the room where I slept, and strange, horrific images would flash through my head while standing in a dark corner by my bed. It's as if somebody had reached out their hand towards me. But as soon as it did, it would go through my body, and I would shoot straight up awake out of bed, and to this day it is still happening. I am now fully involved with the paranormal after strange activity keeps happening. At first, I didn't think much of it, because I'd been dealing with it from such a young age, and things like this have always happened around 1 or so at night. And I also see these strange images appearing like on the back of my eyelids, as if somebody is projecting them into my head. One image was like a video playing over and over. I told myself it's not real, it's just a dream. But when I woke up, something strange had definitely happened. My sister noticed strange claw marks on the back of her neck. She turned around to go to whoever or whatever did it, darting behind her. she thought nothing of it. But I knew what they were. Strange things have happened to me before, after strange activity happens. I just didn't know how long they had been there. I asked her if she remembered being pricked on the back of the neck while sleeping, and she said yeah, it happened a few times. I told her I think something is trying to possess you, and then strange noises began happening around the house, like heavy footsteps behind or outside my door. The strange thing that's happening now is that strange black creatures appear in my room now at night. One night, I saw one standing beside my bed. Its arms were like curved claws. It was bizarre. It was crouching down, looking over me, and then running round to my other side and stood beside. I heard strange noises coming from the corner of the room where it was standing. The reason I'm running this story to you now is because this weird creature appears next to my bed every night, comes back with something different after every few times. It still scares me, but not as much, at least because I've been dealing with it for so long. Now, lately, I've been getting bit on the back of my neck, like sharp little teeth. There is a force that is surrounding us outside the house. I'm not sure what it is. I do know that in the nighttime, I see strange shadows moving outside my house, and this creature that visits our home nearly nightly. I've heard terms thrown around like Skinwalkers and Wendigos, but I have no idea what this thing could be. Any help would be much appreciated. I went camping with some friends up at White Lake State Park. It was this annual thing we all did every year. But for this particular year, I had to go alone. I was camping with my pop-up tent camper. It's an older model, with the inside having virtually no electrical outlets, so it has a light you have to hold while going inside. There were only ever overhead bunk beds instead of a full-size bed on the bottom. Anyway, me being a heavy sleeper usually would be passed out until probably 9 or 10 a.m. So I woke up to use the restroom, and when I came back, I began to start packing from the camp. I noticed that it was super bright outside, way too early for this much sun, if my blinds were closed. I opened my door and see these two strange legs standing outside my window. Whatever this thing was not human. Long skeletal-looking arms, covered in strange scales. It had a skeletal head with no eyes, but there were horns protruding from its skull and kind of a skeletal snout with jagged teeth. This creature stood there staring up into the camper, turned to look at me with the most evil yellow eyes that almost glowed. I felt this tingling on my neck as if something was breathing on me. When I came back to reality, I couldn't move nor scream for help. So I said, "What are you?" And this thing kind of just dissipated in front of me. The sun came up a little while later, and I stayed pretty freaked out by what had just happened. Safe to say, I grabbed my stuff and left ASAP to return home, never to go camping again. Well, at least for a good amount of time after that. I'm really bad at writing, so forgive me if this story doesn't make sense. I'll do my best to try and make sense of it. The time that I was at Penn Lake in Ontario, Canada, I had walked away from the campsite to go pee, and I see these two creatures that are walking on all fours, kind of just trotting around. I think they're large animals, but I could see that something is very wrong. They see me and start growling. They kind of reminded me of hellhounds. Their sounds were demonic, animalistic, and snarl-like. At this point, I began sprinting back to our campsite, only for everybody else to be staring enviously into the campfire. I tried to tell them about what had just happened, about these demonic-looking creatures walking around, chasing after me. They just kind of laughed. I tried convincing them that I wasn't lying, but it didn't work. This might not sound like much to you, but it absolutely terrified me, and I even lost my faith in humanity for a little while. Everybody around me thought I was making this up, or seeing things. Now, I'd been living out in the Canadian wilderness for 6 months before this, with 6 other guys living in a cabin, and I'll never get this image out of my head. It looked like something straight out of hell. It made this awful screaming noise and began charging towards me on all fours. The only thing I could think to compare it to would be the way how predators move when they are hunting prey, sprinting and moving effortlessly, yet so strategically and quickly. It scared me bad. So, when I had ran back to our campsite and nobody believed me, you can imagine why I was so frustrated, beyond belief. Is it possible that this was a dream? But that can't be. I was awake. So how is this possible? How can anybody even sleep or deal with what I did? Does somebody hallucinate this? And if so, how does somebody hallucinate so vividly? How am I supposed to know what happened last night if nobody believes anything I have to say? Now, when my friend told me about her previous encounter, where she apparently saw one walking by the road that she was driving home from work on, the creature, or a creature, looked into her car as she drove past. She said that as she passed it, she looked into her rearview mirror, just in time to see this thing disappear into the woodline. But at this point, I'm not sure if that actually happened or not. And after all, my friend is a realtor, trying to convince us that her previous house was haunted. Before I called BS on her story about demons living in her old home, I would have believed anything with absolute certainty. I'm going to go back to look into Bigfoot creatures and see maybe if that's what this was. Or maybe it was some sort of vampiric creature. Maybe after all it was a Skinwalker or a Wendigo, I don't know. Maybe you can help me figure it out. Either way, I cannot begin to describe what it was like to live out this nightmare. I had an encounter with a Skinwalker in New Mexico when I was in the Marines, stationed out of Holloman AFB. This happened to me and a buddy on our last night in the country. We were getting ready to turn into dirt dogs and head back to the world from an austere location. This had been our home for several months. We would be passing through a small town on Highway 70, headed north towards Alamogordo, where we were going to drop off some equipment before heading back east. It was probably 1 a.m. or so. No road traffic at all. Very dark outside, save for the headlights, illuminating what is directly in front of you within range of your lights, before they become too dim due to the distance from your vehicle. My friend was driving, and I in the passenger seat. We were talking about what we were going to do when we get back to the stateside, where we would live, and all kinds of things you do on a long drive. Nothing unusual or out of the ordinary for any of us. So, as we come right around a curve on Highway 70, heading north towards Alamogordo, there was a thing crossing our path from left to right. It is completely sprinting across the highway, and since this area is so rural, there's no real light pollution. This thing is fully illuminated now in our headlights, and my friend slams on his brakes, which causes the Jeep to fishtail and slide on the gravel shoulder we just turned off of. We both see this thing sprinting across the highway, and we both instantly know what it is. A Skinwalker. One of those evil things that are supposed to be Navajo witch demons. I start yelling for him, "Go, go, go," as I'm reaching for my N16A2, mounted on the back seat. This Skinwalker has stopped in mid-stride right in the center of the road, facing us head-on, but now standing still, blocking our path forward. It looked like a human wearing a coyote skin with glowing red eyes. My buddy floors the gas pedal and we both brace for impact. The Jeep hits this thing dead center, and I'm looking at this thing in the face, followed closely by the sound of breaking bones. Crunch, crackle, pop. We spin out on the gravel shoulder after hitting whatever that was in the road. No one is around to see what happened or provide support if things went bad. Just us against some evil Navajo witch demon thing. We're still sitting around there, stunned, when another vehicle appears coming from behind heading north towards Alamogordo like us. Stops next to us on the shoulder and shines his brights on while honking a horn. The driver gets out and walks up to the Jeep. It's a New Mexico state trooper who immediately starts asking us what happened. Very calm, a very deliberate but firm tone of voice. He listens to our story without interrupting, and says he had just gotten word about a skinwalker that was seen in this area. We get back on Highway 70, heading north, while the trooper follows behind us slowly, so we didn't get run off the road by whatever it was that hit my buddy's Jeep before we could leave this accursed highway. We recap the encounter on the way back to base, and he asks some basic questions about what we had just seen. When we get back to the OFB, we hop online and do some Googling of Skinwalker. Find that there are 2 accounts of Skinwalker attacking motor vehicles before, but not in a desert like this. One was outside Salt Lake City, and the other near Shiprock. We both agree that if it hadn't been for me yelling at my friend when we saw this thing standing dead center of the road, blocking our path, we would have been dead, or possibly worse. I've been wanting now to go back out there and look around for some evidence of something, but I don't know what we would expect to find beyond maybe a coyote's remains. And if we did, maybe all we'd find is a dead coyote, so it wouldn't really prove anything. A lot of things about that night still bother me, and I'm not sure this will ever truly be settled. But that encounter has definitely stuck with us both, my friend and myself. That will never go away.